But I want to begin, there's two prayers at the end of the book, and I just want to begin with the first one, and then I'll end with the second one. This is on page 158, if you want to read along with me. And this is titled A Prayer for Our Earth. All-powerful God, you are present in the whole universe and in the smallest of your creatures. You embrace with your tenderness all that exists. Pour out upon us the power of your love, that we may protect life and beauty. Fill us with peace, that we may live as brothers and sisters, harming no one. O God of the poor, help us to rescue the abandoned and forgotten of this earth, so precious in your eyes. Bring healing to our lives, that we may protect the world and not prey on it, that we may sow beauty, not pollution and destruction. Touch the hearts of those who look only for gain at the expense of the poor and the earth. Teach us to discover the worth of each thing, to be filled with awe and contemplation, to recognize that we are profoundly united with every creature as we journey towards your infinite light. We thank you for being with us each day. Encourage us, we pray, in our struggle for justice, love, and peace. So thanks for being here for our last meeting. I have shown up to each one of these exhausted from the day, but I've left every meeting just feeling a sense of just optimism, hope, and just thankfulness more than anything for our time together. And so I'm excited to have this last meeting, and again, hope that our conversation will continue beyond this. So what I'd like to do today is, you had one chapter, chapter 6. I want to spend about 40 minutes or so just kind of going through, and I'll try to keep us on target so that we hit each of the main points of emphasis in chapter 6. But then after that, I'd like to kind of complete our discussion of the book, but as we said last week, begin to think about what we think this all means for how we might want to proceed, or any ideas. Many of you are on the Peace and Justice Committee. Most of you in here are, and if that's something that you'd like to participate in or join us, we would gladly have you and welcome your participation in the discussion. So we do hope to continue this conversation as a committee, to continue to reflect on and think about how we might continue to approach these issues. So that's what I'd like to do today. So let's begin just by looking at, so in section, this is paragraphs 203 to 208. Pope Francis points us toward a new lifestyle, encouraging us to reject consumerism. And there's one quote that I'll highlight, and I want to ask you a question about freedom. He says this: "We are able to take an honest look at ourselves, to acknowledge our deep dissatisfaction, and to embark on new paths to authentic freedom." So he mentions that if we move beyond this mentality of consumerism, that it helps us to move to a new, or move on, or embark on a new path to authentic freedom. What do you think he means by authentic freedom, and what does that look like? What is authentic freedom? Or think about the opposite of that. What are sometimes the things we think make us free that actually keep us in bondage?
He's talking about materialism. Yeah. Consumption. Really freedom.
It's more a satisfying nature to authentic freedom.
Say it again, Bill.
More of a satisfying nature that you don't have to keep reaching for more, like running a race or winning, or always in search, it seems, with the materialistic. To not only get more, but to get better things. Do you really enjoy them? We have to have store-and-locked places besides our homes to keep going.
Yeah.
I think it goes back to what he said earlier about less is more. I think there's more freedom with the idea that as we give up consuming X amount of paper, water, fossil fuel, whatever, if we consume less, there's a special kind of freedom or reality, a spiritual feeling at the heart of it. It's really nice that we can actually get by and have a very satisfying, healthy, happy life without so much stuff, or without using or consuming so much.
Reminds me of the quote in one of Paul's letters, the truth will set you free. Because there's so much pressure, just as there is with all the materialism, pressure to buy, to keep up with the neighbors, to be fashionable, whatever it is. And so you're never free from it until you let it go.
Exactly.
In paragraph 210, he actually talks about the myths of modernity, which I think is almost the response to what is authentic freedom. It's, the myths of modernity grounded in a utilitarian mindset. And he goes on to say, which is individualism, unlimited progress, competition, consumerism, the unregulated market. And so if we were free from all of those things, perhaps you would say we would have true freedom. However, I have to admit those 5 or 6 characteristics really have been what have defined the United States for so long. So it would be a major mind shift for so many.
That's kind of where I'm leaning into that question, right? So we are within the system, right? So it's difficult. I've heard stories of people who've been on the quote unquote front lines of fighting for environmental freedom and all kinds of justice initiatives that are just as bondaged by their own sense of anxieties that has been brought on by this whole situation, right? So I guess I'm wondering if it has something to do with being within our means, living, I guess I'll put this. It's probably different for each person, depending on the situation that we are in. What that authentic freedom can be. I mean, I don't know. I struggle a little bit with this idea that we all can live an authentic freedom. Like that's one thing that we can define, that everybody can find the freedom in. I don't quite buy that.
I've read on a number of occasions, I guess written by psychologists, that the greatest source of pleasure in life actually comes from our interaction with other people, and particularly when you're gratified by the fact that you did something that somebody else appreciates and helps them. And maybe it's the freedom from thinking that material things will bring you joy and an appreciation that you don't need that. In fact, that's probably a false promise. So look to the freedom that comes from helping someone else and what that gives back to you. Like if Joe is in the kitchen cooking for Code Blue, I would imagine that gives him a great deal of satisfaction. Now he could go out and buy a new suit or whatever else he wants. I doubt that would be the same thing. And I guess I'm not a psychologist, but my understanding is that that's just a fact.
But to illustrate my point, so what if he goes home tonight and he's so overwhelmed by the grief of all the people that he could not feed tonight? Like, it's not just that act, that surely there's something more that has to be in the equation than just I'm not talking about this. I don't even know who you reference, but I'm just thinking, like, is that you can still live a life that is a life of bondage or a life of limited freedom if this burden of this task that's ahead of us doesn't seem like there's an end. If you're just overwhelmed by it, how do you find that freedom in doing it?
We seem to be talking about freedom to give, and there has to be a freedom to receive. And I hope that is a both and situation that we're really talking about, because we, as the privileged people, I think here, we also have to think about what does freedom mean for people who aren't privileged as we are. So I don't know where I'm going with that, but I think it's important to remember that we are the privileged here.
I wonder about a different word than freedom. First of all, it's been kind of misused. I mean, in our country, at least, about, having the freedom to do whatever you please, and who cares about anyone else? I can't think of a word, but the concept of openness, I mean, just the visual image of being open to ideas, to generosity, to all kinds of things. And it's more than just not being bound in a choice. It's just, it's something that is all encompassing in how we look at things.
Is serenity an alternative word?
I don't know if it would be an alternative. I think it would be a component. of it.
Another, yeah.
I think you can use the same word freedom, but the satisfaction comes from freedom from things instead of freedom to things. So,
Good
you were
point.
saying I'm freedom to do this, I please, or I'm freedom from want, I'm free from fear. That even got into the politics that brought us social security back in the time of Roosevelt. And that's what we're looking for now, unity and coming together and having compassion and kindness and all this stuff. And I think doing things for people, you don't want to have the mindset that, well, I don't do enough for enough people, I'm not doing well enough. You can't be everybody, you can only be you, but you don't have to worry about when am I going to get the car serviced, my 3 cars serviced, and my mortgage is paid on 2 homes. And when you maybe don't need some of that stuff, it gives you a freedom from the stress and the emotional and intellectual damage it may cause to you from trying to carry burdens that you don't need to carry. Freedom from want. Burden or eyes for your kids and your cat and kidnap other kids.
Krista, I wonder, tell me if I'm wrong, but what I hear you saying a little bit is it's kind of getting to the question of limits at some level of there's a, I guess what I'm thinking of is I'm thankful that God knows both who we are, but also who we're not, right? God knows what I am and also what I'm not in equal proportion. And that involves a certain set of limits, right? Of, being a creature in Doylestown, Pennsylvania right now, and Doylestown Presbyterian Church, who can focus on a limited number of people. And so that notion of, not feeling burdened by the fact that it's up to us to change the entire world, but it's up to us to act as we've been called to act. I heard that coming through a little bit, Krista, on what you're saying. So I'm not trying to put what it made me think of, but it's not, and maybe where the misuse in the United States is we kind of say, well, hands off, right? It's freedom is, I can do whatever I want, right? It's an absence of limits. But I think what Pope Francis, what I hear him saying loud and clear is you're free when you're serving other people. You're free not from other people, but for other people. And that frees you from things like selfishness and the desire for more desire. We don't even know what that is yet, but we'll figure it out once somebody tells us what we ought to desire. So Chris, I don't know if you want to follow up to that, but I think that's, yeah.
No, that's good. Something in there. Yeah.
Yeah. But that's why I think that question is so important, is we kind of we're confronted daily with this idea of what freedom is. And it's not to diminish any of those accounts wholesale, but to say we maybe have a better way forward. All right, let me move us to, paragraphs 209 to 215 we'll focus on next, and that relates to his account of ecological education, which I find really interesting. And he is, what I hear him saying, this is in paragraph 211. He is saying, let me just turn to that paragraph so I can read it directly. I think it's 211. The note I have that I took from it is that he's saying changing laws needs to be considered alongside development of virtues, right? We need to focus on the act of creating just laws. But if the people who those laws are meant to be delivered to are not also developing proper virtues, then it's all for naught, right? And that's kind of in paragraph 211. Paragraph 215, he says that education, in this regard, this is paragraph 215, the relationship between a good aesthetic education and the maintenance of a healthy environment cannot be overlooked. By learning to see and appreciate beauty, we learn to reject self-interested pragmatism. If someone has not learned to stop and admire something beautiful, we should not be surprised if he or she treats everything as an object to be used and abused without scruple. If we want to bring about deep change, we need to realize that certain mindsets really do influence our behavior. Our efforts at education will be inadequate and ineffectual unless we strive to promote a new way of thinking about human beings, life, society, and our relationship with nature. Otherwise, the paradigm of consumerism will continue to advance with the help of the media and the highly effective working of the market. So we'd love to hear how you're digesting those paragraphs and how you're responding to his notion of what a good ecological education looks like. So how do we produce these virtues is the question, I guess.
I think we produce these virtues by adopting, in paragraph 211, the first sentence, good habits. And it goes on to talk later in the same paragraph on page 138 about the nobility and the duty to care for creation through little daily actions. Now, I'm sorry, but I've forgotten this young lady's name to my right. I've been calling it in my mind. No, River Girl.
Oh, River Girl.
River Girl.
Heather, so nice to see you.
River Girl. I'm sorry, I've forgotten your name.
Heather.
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 Last week, Heather talked about good habits or doing things on a regular daily basis, like using a cloth bag instead of accepting a plastic bag at the supermarket, cutting back on paper goods, or using less water when you turn on the tub or whatever, or the shower. It's these habits that give us the freedom toward helping people, okay, by helping ourselves, or freedom from that consumerism that's not good for the environment or for our souls. Okay, taking time, like Mary Oliver, to notice, the small things, the little things, that habit of daily meditation, so looking at the world with a new mindset that, hey, here, what can I do to make it a better world? Well, cutting back, doing things for others. So it's freedom towards and it's freedom from in the form of these daily little habits that can make a difference in your own life. Like this gentleman over here, Bill.
Yeah.
There's something like we can get hung up trying. We can only do so much. We can't help everybody, or we can't do it all. But we can do these little things daily that add up over time. It's a cumulative process kind of thing.
I was personally moved by what Heather said last week when she said that I think she couldn't in good conscience live out her life and not try to do everything that she could do, while knowing that even if she did that, it's not going to solve the climate crisis. And I've been doing things since Peace and Justice suggested things about gardening and composting and other things, trying to do that at home. But now I almost look at every move, and I'm not now being a slave to this, and it's not got me down. But whether it's the lights or keeping the floor clean, you know, not driving in mud, or those are all things everybody can do and feel better about, because everything gets better at home too. You have time to maybe a little more money to things where finances are maybe limiting certain things. It's actually cheaper to less is more.
But Heather, when you mentioned that, I guess it was at the end of our last session. Well, what can we do? And I think you responded to that. And, you know, it reminded me, thought of it at the time, but didn't have a way to break it. The Serenity Prayer,
Yeah.
Reinhold Niebuhr,
Yeah.
Randy, probably get this wrong, serenity to accept the things I can't change and the courage to change the things I can and the wisdom to know the difference. And that's kind of, I think, exactly what you were talking about. You know, you do what you can, which is change the things, courage to change the things you can. And, you know, you can't let your inability to solve everything paralyze you into doing nothing. I mean, I thought that was an excellent comment. Actually, that's sort of, because the more and more I think about it, well, where do we end up? And that's sort of where we end up.
Yeah.
I wish, you know, I had the capability of doing more, but obviously I don't.
Unless I missed something in Pope Francis's encyclical, which I just reviewed. But I think he also talks about not only individual efforts, but I do think he also says ecological citizenship, working together in community, that our individual efforts are important, but then I'm interpreting that we have to come together as a community to also affect changes that go beyond what we can do individually. So I thought I read that somewhere in here. I don't know.
Well, absolutely, yeah, it's definitely a both and. I think you're absolutely right. And yeah, I totally agree that it is in no way to suggest a kind of hyper individualism where everybody acting out individually can produce the change. And I think that's maybe where he's coming from, even with that quote about the law, is you can have somebody and a great politician who has great ideas about how we're going to do this preservation bit, but if you don't have a society that is going to hear and adopt and act, what good is it? You can't force people into that, right? And so I think, what is it? He says that the person who has the ability to consume more and chooses to back down, like that's where you have some real, you know, somebody that's really understanding. But even though I can do something, and even though something could benefit me and make me feel good in the short term, I should think very hard about what this means for the community, right? Not just what it benefits me.
And I wasn't saying that our individual choices aren't important. That wasn't, you know, but
Sure.
collectively, we can move mountains.
Well,
I
you
think.
know, individually, we can get on board
Mhm.
collectively at the local level, the state and national level. Any kind of programs that are trying to, let's say, for climate change, do away with, you know, any kind of energy that pollutes the atmosphere. Today, I read an article about Germany is trying its very best. It already got rid of black coal, whether that was anthracite or bituminous coal, years ago. They still have a large brown coal industry, but even there's an effort by the government to eventually get rid of using brown coal and just go strictly with solar and wind energy. And I'm thinking solar energy, it's there more than we could ever imagine. And the same way with wind. I mean, can you imagine our government going just for that and not supporting, the miners in West Virginia and in Wyoming, the miners in Wales and in the Northern England, and the miners in Germany and elsewhere around the world have had a long history of many generations of families who were miners and glad to burn coal. But we know, science tells us that that's the, not just coal, but other fossil fuels, petroleum. We've got to stop, or we certainly got to cut back radically. And so, I think if you get on at the local level, or do what you can at the, whatever party is promoting that kind of stuff, that's your good habit, in your small way, just joining and supporting those efforts.
I was reminded the other day of a training video called The Dancing Guide. I don't know if any of you have ever seen it, but it's how do you change a move? How do you create a movement and make change? And it's a guy who is in a field and there's lots of people around him and he stands up and starts to dance. And then a little bit later, somebody else comes and starts to dance and soon the whole field is up and dancing. And it's how do you really start a movement, and it's by starting. And somebody doing whatever that little thing is kind of creates, like, oh, they can do it. Maybe I can do it too. But if you never start, you never get up to dance, nobody else is going to dance either.
It's like Malala.
Yeah.
The gal over. In,
Yeah, right. But it's a very interesting, when you see the whole field up and dancing, but it's how do you start? Somebody does it.
Scotland actually had a great example a few years ago of they had decided as a country not to use fracking, not to use energy that had come from fracking, which had made a decision that put many families that had generationally been involved in things out of work. And so as a country, they were, and maybe others have read about this as well, as a country, they were trying to figure out how to transition those folks into other jobs. And then a ship from the United States with fracking remnants that had come from Pennsylvania was sitting outside of Scotland waiting to be refined. And as a country, they had to decide, do we turn this away because we have made this decision to move forward and move away from fossil fuel, but we currently have families right now who have no jobs.
Right.
And at the time, they turned the ship away. But what a huge dedication, while they were like it was a collective decision, but then those collective people had to agree to support those who no longer had those jobs. And so getting back to your point, we can make individual decisions, but we have to act collectively to reinforce that and make that happen. And that is very hard. But we
Yeah,
have
it
to
takes time and it's complicated.
Yeah.
You have to find new paths of occupations, or the mining families
Right.
are now, finding things in other fields, but
So
it
that
takes
is, that is
time.
one generation of those families who will not have the same standard of living, will not have the same access they had. And so as a country, you have to decide we will support those people in that
Well, I'm
transition.
glad you mentioned Pennsylvania and the fracking, because when I reeled off those places around the world, like Wales and
Yeah,
Newcastle, Pennsylvania, the coal region, Pottsville, Schuylkill County and above, Mahanoy City at Frackville. There's a long history, as long as there have been settlers in this part of the, in the state. That is really what you're talking about, how they're transitioning into something cleaner.
and a big decision. Yeah.
And a lot of those towns are in terrible shape too.
Yes.
They're in
There's a very short paragraph, number 212, that I think maybe one of the most encouraging ones out of, because when he's talking about materialism and consumerism and everything, and those are the people in power, et cetera, et cetera. Sometimes it just gets very discouraging and you just can't. And so then the quote that Dave read about, caring for creation and mundane daily action. So then in 212, he says, we must not think that these efforts are not going to change the world. they benefit society, often unbeknown to us.
Right.
For they call forth a goodness which, albeit unseen, inevitably tends to spread. So that's where you get the whole idea of community. Furthermore, such actions can restore our sense of self-esteem. They can enable us to live more fully and to feel that life on earth is worthwhile. It's so basic.
Yeah.
And we may hesitate to do those small things because they're only small, but they're worthwhile.
Starting to dance.
Getting up and dance.
Who's going to begin?
Yeah.
Let me add to that. Oh, Christo's, see, we couldn't see him. Christo's dancing. I'm the only one that can see you, Christo.
Yay.
Let me add to that. We can continue along this vein. This is paragraph 225 in the section on joy and peace. It says, many people today sense a profound imbalance which drives them to frenetic activity and makes them feel busy. This affects how they treat the environment. Do you have any examples of how that's true, or do you believe that's true? That there's a kind of, we get the sense that our task or our purpose is to be busy, or perhaps that with this imbalance, things are loud, maybe not as they should be, but it kind of drives us to frenetic activity. And he says that that's having a profound impact on the environment.
Like cell phones. Constant.
Says nature is filled with words of love, but how can we listen to them amid constant noise, interminable and nerve-wracking distractions, or the cult of appearances?
I think this kind of goes with the keeping so busy, you don't think about the longer term effects of what happens. There's so many examples that we have of people thinking that this short-term fix is going to just take care of it, only to realize the other consequences and the negative consequences that happen. Thinking about all the garden stuff that we have that we spray on our plants and all of that, that kills our bees and, all of that. But in the short term, people get.
We're so attuned to immediate gratification that there used to be a lot of long-term planning or goals or things like that. And now so much of it has been fragmented into little steps.
Right.
And maybe it makes us, or makes some people feel like they're more in control because it's not as big, but it blurs the picture.
Mhm.
Then you don't see the
Right.
thing.
Right. Can't see the forest for the trees.
Yeah.
I think you hit on something about being in control. There's a tendency in this country to want to be the rugged individual, the Lone Ranger, or the Marlboro Man, the guy that's out there all by himself. But, I guess from that comes a false sense of security, that I am in control, but really, in our society, in our world, it doesn't work that way. We are interdependent. Much more can be gained with cooperation than trying to do it all on your own. People talk an awful lot about their rights today. A little less than I'd like about their responsibilities and obligations to others. And you benefit, I benefit by responsibility exercised by others, and people seeing me as someone who has to be considered in the bigger decisions. I just think that's the way it works. And I think I've said this before, but I think that is the foundation of Christianity. It's a we. We work together. We're not all individuals out there on our own. Some primordial competition with one another. By working together, we all benefit. I think that's basic to Christ's teaching.
Yeah.
Loving your neighbor.
That's the second commandment.
Yeah.
Praise God, number one, and then if you love thy neighbor, you're actually working with or helping, you're being with, you're doing, maybe not, 24/7, but you spend more time helping others in your own community first. And then you branch out if you have the wherewithal or the inclination to do so. There's really no stopping you from what you want to do in connection with that second commandment. All that you're talking about, I think.
There's another thing that just popped in my head that fits in with everything you were saying, Scott, and that's getting credit. There's a lack of humility that when people do something in any forum, they want credit for it. They want to be recognized. They want an accolade. They want a raise, whatever it is. But when you're in true community, you're just part of a body. And you don't need credit. You don't need honor and power. And unfortunately, part of human nature wants power. So it's just like the control thing, which is also a form of power. We get hung up on things that interfere with really being in balance with each other and humble about it.
Me too. It's a power being when you feel that it's limitless. And you only think about yourself and you have the means to do it. Back when paragraph 204, it talks about how that not only that this keeps you from doing the right things, it can lead to tremendous destruction. Said that when it's almost impossible to accept limits opposed by reality, as these attitudes become more widespread, social norms are respected only to the extent that they do not clash with personal needs. And he's saying obsession with a consumerist lifestyle, above all when few people are capable of it, want to go to the head of many houses. It can only lead to violence and mutual destruction. And what did we just see? January 2020, January 26th. I mean, we've got to divide the nation because we all, what's in it for me?
Maybe that's a great analogy, Bill.
We all can't maintain that, even no matter how rich you are at some point. Stuff divided.
Yeah, because when you think about the divided nation, you can't help but also hear about how within everybody's personal lives, there's these, within your unit, there's that same division. So as we're thinking about that individual and collective, they go together and kind of
the
the
left out strikeout too, causing, who may be the cause of the violence of the sort.
Yeah.
In some way as a society.
We had one more quote, and then I do want to move us on to the second part, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this. We won't get to the Trinitarian section. He says, reading reality in a Trinitarian key, which I love that phrase, reading reality in a Trinitarian key. Thinking about what we were just talking about with competition. And I heard somebody say once, they heard in line, somebody say, I'm really competitive. And somebody turned to them and said, well, that's not very Trinitarian of you. And when you think about what that means, right? The Trinity is the model of what true relationality is to be. The Father doesn't compete with the Son or the Spirit. It's that mutual cooperation that is God, right? And that's the kind of the significance of when we confess the Trinity. It's one God, three distinct persons that are not trying to figure out who's the best and greatest, but that are working to bring about reality as such. But here's the quote I'd like to reflect on. This is on paragraph 230, the second half of 230, on page 148 if you have the book. It says, an integral ecology is also made up of simple daily gestures which break the logic of violence, exploitation, and selfishness. In the end, a world of exacerbated consumption is at the same time a world which mistreats life in all its forms. So I just thought that, I don't have a specific question other than to say I thought that was a great summary of many of his points, that when we have talked about the environment as being a material and a social reality at the same time, and the way in which he's asking us to consider love of neighbor as integral and a part of ecology, right? Part of this integral ecology he's calling us to. That to me was a powerful statement of what that's able to confront, which is that counter logic or a counter narrative strategy of, kind of work and do whatever you need to get more power, as Diane was saying, or, it always leads to some form of violence over somebody else, not seeking the mutual benefit or the common good, but seeking your own well-being, and then hoping that maybe that filters down to others, and helps them out. But he's asking us to make that a primary concern. So in those small, simple daily gestures would break the logic of violence. And maybe that's a great reflection point as we start the day. What will my gestures be today that are going to act so as to break the logical structures really of sin and selfishness in the world? But curious to hear just any thoughts you have on that. And then I'd like to move us in a moment to the second part of our discussion.
I think the following paragraph where it says, love overflowing with small gestures of mutual care is also civic and political, and it makes itself felt in every action that seeks to build a better world.
Says it all.
I think can I just interject one thing that I just learned about naming things? And he talks about consumer and consumerism all the time. And a book I just read said, nothing is ever consumed, which I thought of you, Greg, and your waste. Nothing is ever really consumed. It's still there in some fashion. And so the person that I read, Francis Moore LePay, said, we should better call us buyers, not consumers, because nothing is ever really consumed. I thought that was kind of a neat, that we give away naming of things when we really need to be careful about how things are named.
Yeah,
That was
great.
just my PS.
Like an old physics basic tenet about you can't destroy matter. You can only change it, period.
Matter is neither created nor destroyed.
And the second part of that I think is really important for climate change is entropy, because matter is always there in some form, but it always tends toward a lesser degree of order. And so if we have all these fossil fuel reserves that can be turned into any number of useful, beneficial things, and we're making trillions and trillions of plastic bags, I mean, that's just a poor utilization of a potential natural reserve. That is, we can consider that, right? Entropy is a given, but we're accelerating that, right? Like that's, so it does. I mean, it's, the social, you see that connection, the social and the natural. We're only free within the limits of those thermodynamic laws, right? Like that's, those are, you can't escape those.
Following up, the next line to what Kay was quoting is, love for society and commitment to the common good are outstanding expressions of a charity which affects not only relationships between individuals, but also macro relationships, social, economic, and political ones.
Well, maybe now is an apt time then to start to think through the way in which we might start to construct what we called in a previous class arcs, that those vehicles, if you will, that serve as a site of God's grace and this culture of care that Pope Francis is mentioning. So I'd like to, and I'm going to try to compile this list, not to reduce everything we've talked about to like the Letterman top 10, what we need to do in Doylestown, but to try to get at least some action points and action items to start to say what might we do as a community here and now, actions that are perhaps both global, situated in our context, and also that can't help, as we've read, but be global in their implications. So curious to hear that, and wondering if anything struck you throughout this time that you'd like to share. So the floor is open.
You're looking for what we could do? Is
Yes.
that what you said?
Yes.
Well, he even lists some things in 211, in
211.
section 211. He just makes some suggestions. So,
Mhm.
I thought some of those were pretty good. In fact, we had really talked about avoiding use of plastic and paper, reducing water consumption, some very basic things that we could do
Yeah.
as individuals, and then work towards community pieces. Anyway,
Yeah.
is that what you were looking for?
Yeah, I guess, and the reason I'm asking the question, Susan, is one of the critiques of the book from some here was that he doesn't offer, we'd like something a bit more pragmatic, right, or practical, or what, like, tell us what we might want to do going forward, like some specifics. Now, I think there's a certain level of Pope Francis can't and doesn't want to tell us what to do in Doylestown. Right? He's not a member of this community, and so
Right.
I think part of what he's telling us is you're part of a local environment, and it's up to you to kind of use some of these tools, right? You've got the hammer, the nails, and I'm not telling you what house to build, but figure out what's going to fit, and pay attention to your environment and your local environment. And so I guess that's at the heart of the question is, as we continue to reflect as those on the Peace and Justice Committee, this group has spent 4 weeks reading, and let's think about how we hear Pope Francis telling us to act. Does that make sense?
Yeah. On page 149, paragraph 232, starts off by saying, not everyone's called to engage directly in political life, and society is also enriched by a countless array of organizations which work to promote the common good and to defend the environment, whether natural or urban. Then he gives concrete example of how some people, 2 or more people, form a group to show concern for a public place, for instance, like a building, a fountain, an abandoned monument, a landscape, a square, where you just spent, it's just like adopt a highway kind of attitude. On a certain day, every week or every month, you and your friend or friends go out and, pick up the trash, sweep. Maybe somebody's good at pointing if something concrete needs pointing. I mean, just do it out of your heart, out of the kindness of your heart, not to get paid for it, but it's a strictly voluntary, group effort. Whether the group is just a small group of 2 people, or it's maybe a dozen or 2 dozen people get out and let's fix up the square, let's fix up the, the highway or whatever.
Could I give just a little information about something that's not far away where that exact thing happened? Kristen, this is from Kristen. It's called Urban Creators. I don't know if you've ever heard of it. It was started in 2010 by a group of teenagers. And they had a 2-acre area in their neighborhood. It's not too far from Temple. It's along the tracks. And it was a dump. And these teenagers got together and got a lease, a no-cost lease. They not only cleaned everything up, but they've planted it. And so now, 11 or 12 years later, this gardens, it produces organic produce that people in the neighborhood can buy. They have local artists come and do murals and walls and all kinds of things like that. and they have an education center. So with this one little pickup project that a bunch of teenage kids started, they have something that is benefiting their entire community. And it's just, you know, it's kind of like the power of one, or the power of a handful. And, you know, we don't have a dump in Doylestown, but I put a note next to the paragraph that you just read, Dave, about Matthew 25 and working with other people. Not that we would do something for people or tell them what to do, but there may be opportunities that we could partner or support or whatever. Some of these really creative projects that benefit the environment and the people.
I know of a group in Philadelphia that work mainly with people who have been incarcerated, but mostly behind the incarceration was their addiction. And one of the problems for reincarceration is that people can't get jobs and they can't, you know, get back into the workforce. So they're cleaning up neighborhoods. They've gotten a little bit of funds so that they can pay people every day, so that you get your money at the end of the day. And they're people who've just come out of prison, and they're back in the neighborhoods where they were doing whatever it was that they were doing. And there's a video of them, and their rehabilitation rate is quite high. But and they're staying out of jail and they're doing all kinds of wonderful things. But part of what they say is, the one guy was interviewed 20 years ago. I lived in this neighborhood. This neighborhood was a nice neighborhood. Look at it now. It's and he said, and I now have a chance to rebuild that neighborhood. And so I'm back here, and they get paid at the end of each day for their work or whatever. So it's a kind of win-win, but it's that kind of making a difference in a neighborhood where they lived, and the people are no longer afraid of them. Because, so it's an interesting project in Philadelphia.
Piggybacking on what Diane and Bev both said, the Pennsylvania Horticultural Society has a tree tenders program.
Yeah.
And trying to create tree canopy in the heat islands, which are a function of environmental racism. And there are also, if you Google that program, you can see that there are local programs as well. So it's not just the city of Philadelphia. There are suburban groups as well that are trying to plant multiple numbers of trees to try to reduce the heat island and obviously increase property values and try to address a lot of different issues as well as climate change.
I'm actually in their tree tender training program right now. I would
Oh,
be happy to
wonderful.
Share with you all of the materials, should you be interested to have them. It's all of their handouts. It's a great program.
I think what Pope Francis puts a lot of things in this encyclical to pull out, but one of the things in this section was the Earth Charter. He mentions, and I thought, I don't know what that's about. So today I went online and I Googled the Earth Charter, and that's an amazing document. I printed it out, and again, of course, it's too fine a print. But I mean, he introduces little tidbits here and there that we really can look at more closely. And the other one I thought of for you, because I think you're involved in the family here. I mean, family, young people and family stuff here.
Family ministry? Sounds
I'm
like
involved in something.
A program
Yeah.
for family here and young people. He says, plant the seeds of this environmental justice early. He makes that point. And I know he doesn't say specifically what you should do, but he makes a real point that environmental justice, information, creation, care for young is important to start early. So I think that's an important contribution, that he doesn't tell us how to do it, but he sure says start early. You're on that, aren't you?
Oh, yeah. Taken care I printed it out as well, Susan, your charter, to give away if anybody would like a copy. They have
Oh,
16.
Did you print it out too?
Yeah,
It's amazing.
it's a product of, I think, the United Nations. I forget all the details of it, but it is a very interesting, well thought out document.
Yeah, and there are plenty of suggestions in your charter. So he comes roundabout some things, I think, in a unique way.
So in this group.
Personal level, I'm sorry. Go ahead. On a personal level, I look for companies that are certified B Corp, that they have a strong social and environmental emphasis. So one of the changes I've made is I buy my most of my household kind of products from a company called Grove Collaborative. And one of the things that they are doing is they're going beyond plastic. So right now they're plastic neutral, but they also have concentrated cleaners, and the whole goal is to not be using plastic. I'm very happy with the products, but I try to use as many recycled paper products. We don't use any napkins at our house. We use cloth napkins, and we don't use paper, But anyway, I've been on this quest for over 50 years. I started the first day in my community when I was a teenager.
Diane, can you give the name again of that company?
It's Grove Collaborative.
Growth, Growth?
Grove. I can send it. Actually, I
Okay,
can probably put it in the chat, and Greg can send it.
Grove.
And one thing we
Thank you.
can do is spread information about things
Yeah.
like that, because there are people that would jump on it. I never heard of this, but so part of our education is providing information so people can do those little mundane things every day.
Right.
I have fought against the consumerism of our society, recognizing that I have what I need. And so when I want something, my first impulse is to go to a thrift shop, of which there are many wonderful ones in the Doylestown area, where I am here in Florida. And it's part of the thrill of the hunt at that point. I'm not a shopper in general, but I'm trying to reduce by reusing. My last resort would be to buy something new. I'm not always successful, but what I do.
Years ago, we had created a list of local, not too far distant organizations that were worthy of buying environmentally sound products. So I mean, just what was mentioned might be another way to create information for the congregation. Here are some organizations, I don't want to say corporations, companies that are local and support environmental progress.
I think that's a great idea. The local it can be, the better we are doing for our community as well as the environment.
Right.
I feel a little bold making this recommendation since I'm not a member, but would putting some of this education into the curriculum of Sunday school, just having little tidbits or little things to do with the kids and just kind of build that in, starting early.
Yeah,
Could be
totally.
fun.
That's a great focal point. We've talked about getting the youth involved, and there have been, like Club 456 under the previous director, they had a unit on waste and plastics, and we didn't ask them to, it was just kind of, maybe they're interested. So I think that's a great idea. Yeah.
Was that Diane Paul?
Yes.
Diane Paul, yes.
Okay, I didn't know who was speaking.
Correction on Grove Collaborative, it is grove.com.
Oh, thank you. That's easy. Grove.com.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, one example I'm really excited about, especially because people are, since we're on the business point, making a lot more sourdough bread after the pandemic. Even something as little, I learned about a former student of mine at Plumstead. Her parents run the grain mill on Lower State Road,
Yes.
Castle Valley Mill.
Yes,
And they,
Castle Valley?
it's amazing how good,
Yes.
like the flour, and so they have, you can buy online and,
PBS did a special on them.
oh, yeah?
Yeah, not
Wow.
a couple weeks ago.
Oh, wow. I'll have to look
Wow.
that up. Yeah. Fishers,
Yeah,
yeah, they,
yeah.
so I wondered what they were up. I forget how I came across it, but I was so excited. But that's, and a neat example too of some of the conversations where, they're not strictly organic, but they're more concerned about being local, and many of the farmers utilize many of those same techniques, but don't go through all the rigmarole to get certified organic. But it's that idea of, once you start to purchase from, we haven't tried to pit the market against the environment, but we can show how this is one act of where every Pope Francis says every act of buying is a moral act. And so that's one way of saying, hey, we're not only supporting a member of this community who's taken a lot of time and effort in getting this mill back up and functional, but there's benefits of health. But I mean, the story of bread, when I looked into this, it's amazing what we've done to wheat just to make it have more shelf life. We basically stripped it of all of its nutritional value. And so now carbs are a bad thing, but you can, people are shocked when you say, yeah, this bread has a high protein content. What? Bread doesn't. Yeah,
You
it
don't need
does.
to be gluten-free if you use
Yes.
this bread.
Yes.
So anyway, I get really excited when I just talk about
Yeah.
flour bread. So I'll stop. But that's, again, one example that pops into mind. And if you haven't heard of
Milk is the
And,
same.
Castle
and
Valley.
I would like to find out what to do about saving the bees.
Mm.
So
Oh.
in New Jersey, I heard the first night
Yes,
that
it
New
was
Jersey
just-
had gotten some kind of a rule for their parks or something, that they couldn't use the insecticides that were killing the bees. So what can we do to get that happening here?
And what can we plant to help,
Right, to help
all
that,
those kinds of things too.
yeah.
Or mono.
one of the things we can do is plant native, and that will support the bees. We
Yeah.
have a couple of organizations, one Wild Ones of Southeast Pennsylvania. They're the monthly meeting is tomorrow night, virtually. And then the Bucks Women Farm and Garden. We have an annual garden tour, and it's people's yards that are trying to transition to native plants. And there's a whole lot of information behind that. Our next garden tour will be June 18th.
My daughter's house will be on it.
Oh,
And
how
then
lovely.
Kristen.
Diane,
on
whose
Linden
house will
Avenue.
be?
Kristen Winters on Linden Avenue. She's a landscape architect with a specialty in restoration, native plants.
And then how do we work so that people who are in food deserts and don't have the resources that we have, we can't forget how we work to improve that also. I know I sound like a broken record, but I can afford to buy a $6 loaf of bread if it's, healthful. But there are people who are in food deserts who cannot possibly afford a $6 loaf of bread. So I think we have to continue to work. We can do better individually and here, but what does that say? How do we work collectively for people who can't afford what we can? I know I sound awful, but that's, like a broken record.
Oh,
But I think we can't ignore that fact also.
I
as a
just heard
community.
another NPR thing that there is something with the restaurants in Philadelphia that instead of a group of women found how much they're throwing out, and they were able to end up having some kind of an alert that goes out at the end of the day. Instead of throwing the stuff out, they send it out and you get a bag of whatever it is for $2. So they have, like, if you have bagels that they would have thrown out, they don't throw them out. You can go and you get a whole bag of them, and it's sort of a win-win. But there are more and more restaurants in Philadelphia that are starting to do this. And it's one of the ways that families that couldn't afford otherwise to have some of this stuff
Yeah.
have it. And they're making games with the kids so that they can figure out what they can get and teaching them how to do all of that. You know, how to go to which kind of store to go and get this, or which bakery, or which bakeries too, but which restaurants.
There's
I think
also-
they have an app for it, don't they, Bev?
Yeah, I think so. I saw.
Yeah, and it's helping to reduce food waste as well as providing healthy food for people who
Right,
don't always
healthy
have
food,
the
yeah.
opportunity. Rolling Acres is a local one that we support. But Bucks County Food Shed Alliance kind of addresses some of those as well. They're behind the Doylestown Farmers Market as well as some other local programs.
There's a CSA type organization, and I can't remember the name. Kristen knows it and I can get it. It's ugly food or something like that. You know, it's the things that are lopsided.
Yeah.
But you can, just like a CSA, you can order what you want. It gets delivered and it's affordable and it doesn't go to waste. I mean,
Right.
win, 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 right down the line.
Right.
And people who would not be able to pay $6 for the loaf of bread or for, you know, some plums or whatever can get fruit.
Right.
It's not going to be on the cover of a magazine, but it tastes just as
It's
good and
just-
it's
yeah.
just as healthy.
Is that Misfits Produce? Is that, I think it's Misfits Produce, isn't that what it
It
is?
might be.
Well, there are two. I think there's Misfits Produce and Ugly Fruit.
Ugly fruit.
Yeah.
But Diane, I'd love to back you up on your recommendation of rolling harvest. And they've worked with so many local farms to send volunteers in to glean a field when it's no longer profitable for a farmer to send workers in to get the rest of their food. And then that's food available to food pantries and hospitals and things like that. And it's a wonderful organization. So if there's something that DPC could partner
We've
with
done
them.
it for years.
We do.
Yeah.
I was gonna say, I love it.
Yeah.
It's so great.
It's gleaning. It's
That's
the old
right.
Yeah.
concept of gleaning.
Right.
isn't it?
That's right. Well, good.
Well,
See, you're
it's
already
moved-
doing something.
You know, I'm gonna get myself into trouble here, but I guess
Oh,
I
oh,
might as well,
Good
we're running
trouble.
out of time.
Good trouble.
This book is about, seems to me, basically attitudes that you should have in order to properly address the issue of global warming and poverty and misery and suffering in the world. And a couple sessions ago, Judy Cody was here, and she mentioned, she put some emphasis on compassion, which, you know, I think we're preaching to the choir here if we're going to say compassion is an important thing. But sometimes I wonder if the church is as effective at that message as we could be. And what I'm saying is that a lot of what we do as a church deals with belief. And, you know, belief drives behavior, but compassion is a behavior. I just wonder if we don't need more emphasis on the behavior side of things. Now, I personally, I don't care what people believe. I really don't. I care how they behave. And I think a lot of people feel the same way, basically. You can be, you know, a Hindu, a Muslim, a Jew, a Christian. You can be gay or straight. You can be any, it doesn't matter. If you're a decent person and you basically live as Christ said we were supposed to live, you know, that's no further inquiry is required. And I basically believe that, but the message of the church isn't quite there. You know, it's still, and it has been throughout its history, you gotta believe these things. And a lot of our time in church has been emphasizing that message. I'm not sure that's the right emphasis. Now, Matthew 25, I think, is a great initiative, and it points in the right direction, and that's a shift in sort of maybe, you know, why didn't we take that up 50, 100 years ago? And maybe something did, but it almost seems to me that we should deliberately put emphasis on the part of Christianity, which is what Christ taught. and not de-emphasize belief as much as. Here's a problem I see with young people. A lot of young people are not coming to the church. And, frankly, they look at Christians as being hypocritical. I look at a lot of Christians as being hypocritical. We wouldn't have had the government we had for 4 years if Christians were hypocritical. And we're all tarred with the brush of hypocrisy. Young people look at us like, I want nothing to do with Christianity, bunch of hypocrites. They talk one thing, they do something entirely different. And they're right. And so a part of what maybe we need to do is to make sure our messaging is on target. I mean, if people aren't responding, if they're not, your message doesn't resonate, seems to me there could be two things going along. One is it's not a good message, and the other one is you're not getting the message out. And maybe it's a combination of both in our case, but I think we just need to be sure that our message has the right emphasis. And my final thought on this is I have some nieces and nephews who won't have anything to do with church. But I think there's as good Christians as most Christians I know, or better. Instinctive. They get it, and they've got that compassion thing, and they understand it. But they won't come to Christianity. They won't. They just their whole view of it is negative. In fact, I have one. She's the wife of a nephew of mine. She will not allow her daughter to come to church because of the cross. She does not want her little girl, who's about 3 now, to be looking at a cross and thinking about some person who was nailed to the cross and suffered horribly on the cross. Now, I haven't thought of that before, but that's a message that I think keeps them, is one of the things that keeps them away from the church. So, again, I guess all I'm getting at is, are we really sure we got the right messages going out to the rest of the world to get the people in here that we really want? And sometimes I think, maybe not exactly. The image that I like is Christ the Redeemer. You know that down in Rio de Janeiro, there's this big statue, and the figure of Christ is standing up there with his arms open. I mean, that's a human gesture of love and acceptance that I think everybody can understand. And, if I was a marketing person, I might be inclined to say, well, you need to look at your marketing a little bit and make sure that's on target. So I don't know where that goes, and that's not going to solve the global warming, issue that we're facing, but it might, this is the choir here. We don't, most of us can do better. I certainly can. But we don't need to get the basic message that you need to be more compassionate and help poor people, and the world has to be fed, and all that kind of stuff. But maybe we can convince more people that Christianity has something to offer beyond what many people view as the Christian message, which is oriented very much on belief. You got to believe this, you got to believe that. Maybe not quite so much on compassion. That turned out to be a sermon.
Love and kindness, period.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, what more do you need to know?
You don't need to complicate it.
Yeah. I mean, do unto others, love your neighbor, what you've done to the least of these, new commandment I give you, to love one another. I mean, that's the core to me of Christianity. And I don't think the average the people I know that I think are innately have a Christian attitude view the church as in that way, in the way that I described. That's it.
I mean, that could definitely lead us down a very long theological discussion. So I appreciate those thoughts. But,
David Brooks just wrote an editorial.
I saw that.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things that I thought was interesting is that who he was suggesting might have some solutions was a Presbyterian minister.
Yes.
And
Tim
that sort
Keller,
of gave me some hope.
yeah.
Yeah, But I think a lot of what he said in that article was impactful and interesting for us to sort of spend some time dissecting it sometime.
Yeah, it's a great idea. Because I think what happens if we start to pick and choose our version of Jesus is we end up with something that's not Jesus, right? Like we don't get to select the vision. Otherwise, we're left defining love and compassion on our own terms. I think that's a danger of young people believe a lot of things that we don't think are right to believe, right? So they're not off the hook with, there's a reason Kylie Jenner has X millions of followers, right? Like I wouldn't say that's a model of faith, but it's somebody that has a lot of power in developing narrative strategies of how they see the world. And I think you're right. I think the book of James is very instructive in that regard, right? Belief without action, is not belief, right? And so in weeks 1 and 2, we talked about everybody lives by certain central axioms and claims, and we're all believing people. We can't help but live out what we believe, whether we're aware of it, whether we can articulate it or not. Our actions demonstrate who we are as people, as believing things. And so I think the question before us is, what do we believe, and why do we think that climate change is worth addressing? We all do. I think you're right. This is the choir of people who understand that. And yet we still get things wrong, right? We're still just as prone as everybody else to screw it all up. And I'll start with myself, right? Paul says that I'm the worst of sinners, and that's our starting point. Is Mark and I were talking about the logs that are lumbering out of our eyes at the beginning, and we try to find those specks in everybody else. So again, maybe this is getting us. I appreciate that, Scott, and I think we could have a very long discussion about the church, how the church demonstrates its belief and what it's teaching and what it's giving the world. And is it good news? Is it good news?
It's doing a lot of good things. Like I said, Matthew
Yeah.
25, I think is an excellent initiative. And that gives me real hope that,
I have an African-American friend who, when I first became moderator of Matthew 25, I went to him and said, okay, Roland, what would you like to see? What do you think is important? And he said, you need to have everybody answer the question, can you love your neighbor as yourself?
Mhm.
And if you can't, then we're never going to get over this. And I thought, yeah, it's an important question to ask. Can I do that? He said, that's not lip service. It's hard. It is.
That's where the rubber meets the road.
I'm sorry?
Where the rubber meets the road.
Right.
That's
Can you do
where-
that?
Yeah.
I often thought a good class would be all the questions that are asked in the Bible. Like, am I my brother's keeper? Do you love me? I mean, just go through the questions that are asked. I think if we had a class on that and thought about that, might be tough.
Yeah. I mean, the Bible is definitely not a book of answers, right? We can at least start there, that it's not, that we understand it as scripture, right? It has this, there's a reason scripture is in our pews, right upstairs, and not other historical documents. But it's not simply this kind of this, here's 10 principles, and if you follow these, right? Like it's the story of the good news. It's the story of God made known among the people God has made. And so when we read it, we're reading it as people of God in a certain time and place. We're dealing in 2022 with issues of the climate. And so does the Bible address climate change directly? Maybe not directly, but it sure does have a lot to say about what we ought to do, what some of the sources of climate change are, like any.
I think it does. We're to till it and keep it. And we aren't doing a good job of that.
I totally agree.
So I think there are little hints in the Bible now and then.
Oh, yeah. It's also,
Some hints that are scary, like Ecclesiastes, vanity of vanities,
Oh,
all is vanity, nothing new in us. Which is saying everything's pointless, really, ultimately. I mean, it goes a little deeper into, the things that you should appreciate are just the simple acts of eating and drinking and doing things with people in a loving way for God, period. Because everything else, like the destruction of the earth, the planet, is going to be a goner someday, no matter what we do to combat climate change. You know, it's just a matter of time. It may be billions of years. Or if you can imagine transmigrating, you know, God created the universe, not just the solar system or the earth. But science might lead us to transmigrate to some other livable planet somewhere, some other galaxy someday, because this earth has been destroyed either by ourselves or by nature itself.
Well, I do want to be respectful of our time. I would love to stay longer with all of you, and I'm happy to hang out if anybody wants to stay. And hang out. But I do want to be respectful. Let me end with this. And again, this is a strong encouragement to any of you that are not on Peace and Justice. If you want to continue this, even in a temporary manner for a little time, come join us. You're more than welcome. This is the epilogue to Ecclesiastes. I'll read this, Dave. I think this is instructive, and then I'll finish with Pope Francis's second prayer. It says, "The end of the matter," this is after explaining Vanity of Vanities, "the end of the matter, all has been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments, for that is the whole duty of everyone. For God will bring every deed into judgment, including every secret thing, whether good or evil." So I think that's how the author ends that philosophical treatise by saying, it's all meaningless, but here's what's not meaningless, right? Yeah. Serve God. God will bring things into judgment, and it's not, we act those acts of service. God will magnify those gifts, and we trust in that. Let me end with Pope Francis's prayer. Let me thank you once again for all of your participation. It really has meant a lot, and so glad to have shared this journey with all of you. And this prayer is called A Christian Prayer in Union with Creation. Let's pray. Father, we praise you with all your creatures. They came forth from your all-powerful hand. They are yours, filled with your presence and your tender love. Praise be to you. Son of God, Jesus, through you all things were made. You were formed in the womb of Mary, our mother. You became part of this earth, and you gazed upon this world with human eyes. Today you are alive in every creature in your risen glory. Praise be to you. Holy Spirit, by your light, you guide this world towards the Father's love and accompany creation as it groans in travail. You also dwell in our hearts, and you inspire us to do what is good. Praise be to you. Triune Lord, wondrous community of infinite love, teach us to contemplate you in the beauty of the universe. For all things speak of you. Awaken our praise and thankfulness for every being that you have made. Give us the grace to feel profoundly joined to everything that is. God of love, show us our place in this world as channels of your love for all the creatures of this earth, for not one of them is forgotten in your sight. Enlighten those who possess power and money, that they may avoid the sin of indifference, that they may love the common good, advance the weak, and care for this world in which we live. The poor and the earth are crying out. O Lord, seize us with your power and light. Help us to protect all life, to prepare for a better future, for the coming of your kingdom of justice, peace, love, and beauty. Praise be to you. Amen.
Great, thank you for having
Thank
us.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.